Everyone, welcome back. Last time we were taking a look at the introduction to modernism as we begin this third and final unit of the semester, and we've talked about some of the intellectual developments during that time that shape the way that the modern world sees humanity and our encounter with nature. I wanted to take a look at how we see a shift within this in visual art. Right, art's always going to reflect the culture in which it was created, the values, the ideas, what's important, how they understand who am I, where am I going, and why am I here. So as the modern world starts to shift and industrialize, we're going to see art start to change and look differently as well. And I want to take a look at some of those ideas that will introduce our discussion of modern art for the next week. What you see here is a self-portrait by Arnold Schoenberg and also one by Rembrandt. And so what we see is one is a classical representation of the human condition, and one of them is more of a modernist representation. And to think about this, right, something to consider. We've talked a lot about Renaissance art and how it casts this shadow over the art world, that all art is going to be judged by Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and the like. But what happens within the modern world is the modern world starts to say, well, that doesn't really represent who we are. So we're going to see art start to change. And so I wanted to, just as we move towards at the end of the semester, I want us to just pause for a moment and consider how we're defining art. What do you think that it's like? Does art have certain criteria that you think that all art should have? So I would like you to consider how you would define art. Start with a basic definition and then write what you consider to be good or better or inspired art. What does the art look, sound, or feel like to you? And so think about some of the ideas that we've been talking about this semester. We've talked about music and literature and visual arts. What is art? What is art seeking to do? And so consider some examples as you refine your definition. So just pause the video for a few minutes and write your definition of art. As you think about these two that I'm just kind of showing you for examples, where would you classify one in comparison to the other? Would one be superior? Would one not be? And then try to find the rationale for it. So as we come back, right, I want you to also consider the other side of this. Part of any good definition considers what something is and what something is not, right? As you define art, please consider what is not art and why. And so as you think about what are you kind of kicking out of your definition, what would not be considered good or great or best art, or just art in general, right? And this is getting us to really start to find concrete ideas to abstract principles, and that's important. Sometimes we tend to stay in the abstract, and when we stay in the abstract, it just gets all kind of weird, and there's no real clear understanding of it. Some people say that art is this ethereal oneness with the universe, or some type of emotional fulfillment, whatever, and we don't really know what that is. But once we start finding examples of it, then we can start pinpointing, okay, what are some of the common criteria? And these are some of the humanities type questions that we're really concerned with. And so you think about what your definition of art is. I want you to think about, just kind of pause the video for a moment and think about what art is not, right? What would not be considered art and why? As we take a look, I wanted to examine Tolstoy's argument today in his essay entitled, What is Art? And he's taking a look at art in the modern world and how art in the modern world is significantly different than anything that comes before it, because we're living in a significantly different age. He says, about objective criticism, he says that previously art attempted to be defined objectively, judgment based on a set of criteria, as opposed to subjective criticism, which focused on individual taste or opinion. Objective art set the standard. And so the idea of objective art was that it was supposed to be visual. As we see with the Renaissance, it had to have the proportions accurate and had to represent the way that the eye sees. And the closer it represents the way the eye sees, the more beautiful it was considered. And as we move into, the next several centuries, we keep a pretty much regimented, similar definition of what art is. Sometimes they vary a little bit. Romanticism starts to question this a little bit with more of focusing on artistic imagination and emotion and style. But what we're going to see within the modern world is they're really going to start questioning this idea of, does art purely have to have these, laundry lists of criteria? Because if you start to just say that it has to have a checklist, then it starts to become problematic. And what we have within the art world are these juries that you'd submit. If you're an artist, you'd submit your art to a jury. That jury would decide how well it met that set criteria, and then it would either accept it or not accept it. If it was rejected, you could not get your art certified, and therefore your art was essentially valueless, right? So you couldn't really sell it. And so, but the idea that Tolstoy is suggesting is that maybe that's set standard, right? It's too regimented. And maybe we need to define different ways, right? And we need to kind of remove ourselves from that tradition of art to find a new way. And past beauty was defined, and within art was on this idea of absolute perfection or pleasure, as we see with Michelangelo, right? The absolute perfection of the human form, the ideals, right? It was supposed to have imitation to look realistic. It was supposed to be suitable to its object, right? If a work is the ideal, right, then it should represent the ideal. If it's representing the divine, it should strive for that ideal. It should also have harmony, right, in all of its pieces, such as the lines, the color, the shading, all designed to bring pleasure to the viewer, to be uplifting and to provide some type of deep type of emotional engagement. And it also has to have some type of unity, that all the pieces, the lines, the colors, the shading, etc., have to fit together, right? So it's not as though that they just have to, be in the right place. They all have to fit aesthetically together to produce that pleasure. And so that was really the focus, that beauty is this drive for providing pleasure, emotional pleasure for the viewer. But the problem is with this is that we don't really define anything else based only on pleasure, right? We don't really define food based purely on pleasure. I mean, that's part of it, right? We define it kind of based on how well it is. But I mean, if all we did was, made food choices based on its pleasantness, right? All we would be doing is eating brownies and ice cream, right? So there's got to be more to it than just simple pleasure. It might be a little bit too superficial to focus only on that. And then he also argues that this objective criticism was focused on this canon, right? This art was defined based on what the past has done. The canon is just kind of this standard of past, whether it's art, literature, music, whatever the case may be, the great artists of the past, and so how well it measures up to that greatness. But the problem with that, though, if you're measuring art based on the greatness of the past, is it's really hard to do something new and innovative, right? Art almost becomes stagnant, and so he's suggesting that maybe there needs to be different definitions of art as we try to find new paths to understand this modern changing world, right? So the past definition of art is mainly it's an activity from a living organism that produces an emotional response, right? It's an external manifestation based on colors, lines, movement, sounds, words that evoke the emotional response. And it can either be, a temporary kind of, feeling, or it could be something that's permanent, right? But the idea is that's mainly about, the viewer and how the pleasantness of the viewer. And this is where we get kind of into the modern world. And as I teach modern arts each semester, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? People tend to think that art should be pleasant. And if it's not pleasant, as we see here with Munch's Scream, the idea is not to create a pleasant work. They say they don't like it, therefore it's not good art, right? And Tolstoy is suggesting we need to be careful with that. we need to suggest that there must be something else out there than just defining it based on this objective laundry list of criteria that it has to meet in order to produce a pleasing response, right? That he argues that type of art has become emotionalist. If you're just painting a bowl of fruit over and over and over again, right? Then where's the newness? Where's the sense of passion within the artist? And so they're suggesting there's got to be a new way to find it. And the idea for this is that it's not going to be rooted in the past. We need to find different directions. And so Munch's The Scream is just going to be a representation, right, of this modern world and this standard of art that's changing. This new definition that he argues is that rather than focusing on aesthetic beauty, right, how well it mimics the exterior world, he suggests that art should be defined on communication. And that's a big difference. If you're focusing on imitating the natural world or how the eye sees, then you're only focusing on visual reality. But if you change the emphasis to communication, it just opens up the whole world to a new way of seeing art, right? Because you can communicate any number of ways. That doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in visual reality. And so this is kind of a different type of idea. He suggests that all art also should have a shared experience, meaning that it should be a way for people to be able to, part of that communication is a connection, something that we can all identify with, something that we can all say, oh yeah, I see where you're coming from, right? And it should destroy the boundaries between the artist and the viewer, right? Trying to tear them down as much as possible to try to facilitate that communication better, right? To create that dialogue, right? But he suggests that art, at its very core, as part of this communication, it should be moving humanity in general towards perfection, leading us in a way to better ourselves. And in that way, I mean, in some ways, it's very similar to the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance was seeking to push us towards this idea of perfection. But they're going to do this differently. Rather than doing it through the visual, they're going to do it through ideas and communication. And a big game changer, and we'll talk more about this later, but a big game changer during the 1800s is the camera. Once the camera was invented, right, the artist's stranglehold over representing visual reality was all but lost, right? Because anyone can come up with a camera, push a button, and can take a visual reality, can replicate the visual world within the camera, right? And so it seems to, in some ways, uproot or displace the modern artist. And so the modern artist is contending with this new scientific invention, which is in some ways threatening their livelihood, but also they're confronting with all of these new ideas that we've been talking about with the Victorian era and Marx and Darwin and Nietzsche. And they're taking a look at this idea of urbanization, and they're suggesting we need to do something different. And so this is the type of art that starts to be being produced by artists. And as you take a look at this, we kind of taken a look at the George Grosz and Egon Schiele image previously, but something to kind of think about, right? As people take a look at this and they immediately dismiss it and say it's ugly, right? The idea of it is not to be visually beautiful. It's to communicate an idea. It's for people to kind of think about, yeah, I feel as though when I go to work, I feel as though I'm being exploited. I feel as though I'm losing my soul. I feel like I'm losing my humanity, and I'm becoming part of a machine within this kind of modern world. Or as we see with the self-portrait on the right-hand side, people can identify with that, right? It's about communicating a shared experience. I can feel as though there are forces out there in the modern world seeking to harm me in some way, right? And so we feel as though the world is somehow this battleground for competition for resources, that it feels as though that they're not necessarily in our favor. And I guess COVID is one example of something out there that feels kind of ominous, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be work, it could be war, it could be it just could be social forces that are trying to define who you are and trying to resist that. And so again, it's not about trying to represent visual reality. is about representing the human experience and communicating that. And again, it's not necessarily meant to be beautiful. It's meant to be thought-provoking, and it's meant to hold a mirror up to us, to get us to take a look at the world around us, to critically think about it, and to hopefully, right, moving us towards perfection, to change, right? We see that again with Degas, the absinthe drinker, right, where he's representing some of the hardships that people can see if you're living in a downtown rural area community and you're part of that lower class. You feel this, right? You feel the weight of the modern world resting on your shoulders, and you feel as though you're trying to achieve that bourgeoisie dream, but it just feels as though there's forces out there that are just making it very difficult to be able to attain it. Another example of modern art, right, would be Lin's Vietnam War Memorial, right? So again, it's not about trying to represent something visually beautiful or mimic the exterior world. It's about communicating ideas. It's about communicating a shared experience. It's about getting us to think reflectively, right? So the idea that placing the idea in the driver's seat rather than visual reality changes the way art is going to look. And that is key to understanding what's happening within the modern world. We can't necessarily just suggest, well, if it's beautiful, it's good, and if it's not beautiful, it's bad, or if it represents the visual world, then it's good, and if it doesn't, then it's bad, because artists aren't looking at art that way, right? Tolstoy is putting together, right? He's explaining what's happening within modern art. He says great art is as follows. It says, great art expresses individual feelings strongly to transfer more intimate feelings to the viewer, rather than focusing on just the checklist of whether it's visual reality, which can become sterile, which can become emotionless. He's suggesting it's about the artistic expression. And so with Monet's Water Lilies, it's about the expression of how he's feeling, how he's seeing the light reflected off the water, how he's feeling within the representation of the spring that he's representing, or sometimes he does this during the fall, or sometimes he does it during the winter. As he takes a look at the seasons that surround him, he's representing his feelings. And so it's not necessarily about visual reality, because his images are pretty fuzzy. It's about doing something else, right? And we see the similar idea with Van Gogh's Starry Night. It's not about necessarily representing this small town area. It's about representing his own individual experiences with it, and that's what's important. So the camera, right, the changes the way that artists start thinking about art. And so the real major difference between anyone who has a camera and an artist is the insights that the artist has, the individual interpretation of the world and their experiences within it. And so that's what you see, artists going more inward than outward within the art world. And we'll see that as we go through some of the visual art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He says also it's about clarity, right? Clarity is important to display a strong, clear message. Now, sometimes that message isn't going to be immediately discernible to us. Sometimes it's going to take a little bit of work on our part to be able to, understand where the artist is going, because it's not visually representational. And visual art is very easy to understand. Their art, as they turn inward, you might have to take a little bit more work to understand what's going on. But once you do, then it becomes very clear, and then it becomes very immersive. And then he says that art should be about sincerity, the true feelings of the artist, rather than some type of past traditions or styles that are imposed that stagnate the art world. It's about truly what the artist is feeling. And so this is about deep, deep introspection of the artist, and that's what art is about. It's about the artist turning inward and trying to understand how he or she is experiencing the exterior world, and trying to process that, communicate those ideas so that other people can see that, can identify with it, and then hopefully change to improve society for the better. And so these are just a general overview of some of the ideas that we're going to see as we continue to study art in the modern world.